Hi everyone, my name is Matt Ferguson, managing partner at Sonar, and you join us here today to discuss what's going on in the Asian insurtech scene. I'm joined here today by our good friend George Kesselman from Insurtech Asia. George, please, over to you. I'd love to hear a bit about yourself, who you are, what you do, and what we're going to chat about today.
Perfect. Thanks very much, Matt. And very happy to be with you here today. What I wanted to just do a quick introduction, and then we just dive right into what was going on in the region here, where there's a lot of very interesting things emerging. As Matt mentioned, I'm George Kesselman. I wear two hats. One hat is in Insurtech Asia, so this is an association that I founded now coming up to I think 6-7 years ago, and it was there from the early days where we were still talking about how to pronounce insurtech, whether it's insurtech or insurtech. And then we were there through all the initial excitement to kind of gathering the community, building up the ecosystem to the point where it is right now, where it's a lot more mature. And now it's coming together again to really create that substance and create that collaboration that probably in the last couple of years has been a little bit slower because of COVID. So myself, I lead the Insurtech Asia, and then we're expanding across the region. So right now the hub is Singapore, and in the past we've done events across the region, as far as Australia and Japan. And big focus for us has been in Southeast Asia, but it's not kind of by design. It's primarily just because there's been a lot more activity in the region. So the second hat that I wear is also an interesting one, and I think is very relevant to our conversation today. Is I am a chief commercial officer for ZA Tech, which is part of Zhongyang Group. It's a very well-known brand, I guess, in the insurtech space. One of the early movers, and still at the very much at the forefront of what's happening in the space. We're an insurer in China and have grown to be a #1 leader in the market in the digital space. But vice versa, we also have a JV outside of China in the international space to really focus on the technology and a lot of exciting things that we're going to talk about. But it's very much an infrastructure play. Together with a SoftBank, and we have a JVs with the portfolio companies from the SoftBank. So it's kind of a very interesting fusion and combination where we bring together the tech from China to the international markets, adopted to different use cases, very much starting from the embedded space and now moving into all this kind of very interesting other use cases. So without much further ado, I guess I'll jump right into what's happening in the region. And Asia is definitely not a homogeneous region, and when we talk about Asia, it sounds like it's just one place, but a whole different variety of countries. But there are certain themes that I think as kind of overarching themes that are coming about, and I think that's why it makes it very interesting to talk about diverse region. So on one side, I guess we have very big markets like India and China, which themselves are kind of massive domestic markets. And then we have Southeast Asia, which is a very diverse region made up of 15, 16 countries that are fairly fragmented, but there are big clusters like Indonesia is a big market by itself. And then there's smaller countries that all kind of seeing various different models emerge and try to scale across these different divides and the country and regulatory space. So the two things that I think are very interesting and relevant for us to discuss today. First of all, everybody is talking about the embedded space, and in the region here, I would say that again, kind of it starts with the big markets like the China and India again, and by itself, because it's such a big market, there's a lot of experimentation that's happening. And what we've seen is that the embedded space have really reached the scale of maturity in those markets. So it started probably a couple of years earlier than maybe other places. You probably heard things like return shipping insurance being experimented in the early days, and many other things in this kind of a micro insurance space started to emerge and being embedded within digital platforms being embedded within all kinds of potential use cases. And we are at the point where that have spilled over to Southeast Asia as well. We have this super app here that's called Grab, kind of like an Uber of Southeast Asia. And what's been very interesting is that they've launched this about three and a half years ago. And they were early mover in that space, but now they are at the scale where they're doing something like 200 million insurance policies per year. So definitely is that kind of a scale that's already, is no longer in experimentation. And it did take them quite a bit of tweaking to figure out what is that product that is going to scale. And we can talk about it a little bit more. But generally that the vertical of the embedded insurance is something that have been a very quickly growing and maturing segment for Asia. And I think the second one, which is also very interesting and relevant, I think there are a lot of questions about, okay, how does this embedded insurance touch life, health, like a bigger ticket size products? And what becomes very clear is that when it comes to this bigger size products, there is this new kind of approach that is emerging very clearly. And I would say it's still earlier in that journey than the embedded space, which has already kind of reached that scale. But what we're seeing very clearly is that the omni-channel approach is something that is becoming a lot more prevalent, and it's touching a lot more, I would say, core parts of the insurance than the embedded space. And embedded is like a disruption where it comes in the space that was new, and now the omni-channel is coming in the space where it's touching the traditional products, traditional distribution, and is really coming into to reshape that segment.
Could you, sorry, George, could you give us a, I've the term omni-channel comes with a whole load of preconceptions and triggers lots of things for lots of people. Could you give us a practical example or describe the ways in which you're seeing, which channels are being joined up or connected or integrated?
So the most common way for the omnichannel right now in the region is that basically it's the agents or the networks of agents that are very loosely organized that are using this as the way to propagate insurance. So for example, in Indonesia, professional agents using this as a way to send QR codes to their WhatsApp networks. And then the people from there can easily scan it, and then they start the journey into kind of exploring insurance, understanding insurance, and there are points of interaction with the agents, but it's much more reshaped towards that on-off type of journey. So it's not. It might start through WhatsApp, somebody receiving a message through WhatsApp, and then they might kind of click in it and read through it. And then the agent can come into the discussion and he can discuss it with the potential customer, and then the customer might go in and just pay electronically for that policy. So it is. I definitely take your point that it's a misused term a lot of times, where agents selling through Zoom, sometimes they call it omni-channel way, but it's basically I would say it's a fairly traditional way of selling it, just replacing a face-to-face, to the screen kind of an interaction. So to me, that's still a very traditional approach, where something like this is merging basically the online, offline in a very different way.
Yeah, it's that classic digitization of an existing process as opposed to creating a completely digital experience, right?
Absolutely. So that's kind of the immediate things that are happening. And so first, the embedded space, which is touching a lot more on the general insurance products. So things that really took off is, for example, in the Grab ecosystem, is like personal accident, micro insurance being embedded within the user journey. So a lot of that has been picked up with the customers and very well received. So it's personal accident bundled with a delay in the pickup. So customers generally see that as something that's very cohesive to their journey. What we're also seeing definitely is a lot of interest from the e-commerce platform to add the warranty, accidental damage type of product together with electronics, mobile phones, all that kind of stuff that is, in the customer's mind. I think it comes very, very closely together with that core proposition. What we also discovered, I think, by talking to all those platforms, like last year, we did this report together with BCG where we talked to like tens of platforms and trying to understand kind of how do they think about it, which use cases work well for them. It is very much about the experimentation. You can come in with a hypothesis that your drivers need insurance, but it ends up being something that's completely different. But that iteration is something that's very inherent in the nature of the embedded products. So it takes on average, based on our discussion, somewhere between 10 to 15 of those iterations, adjustments to really find that product market fit with the platforms.
Really interesting. Okay.
So that's on the embedded space. And I think the other thing that I wanted to highlight, and that's a kind of a common question that comes about is, okay, so embedded is small, usually it's a sub-dollar kind of amounts. So what about the larger ticket size insurance? We're talking about tens of dollars to hundreds of dollars. And the hypothesis from a lot of the platforms was that you can upsell the customers that start with the embedded products, with the kind of a sub-dollar products. Once they experience insurance, once they experience the claim, you can offer them a bigger ticket size, more traditional insurance, let's say either motor insurance or home insurance or even health life. But what it turned out so far is that it's very hard to transition, because in customer's mind, it's a very different type of proposition. So first of all, I'm taking a ride on your app, or I'm buying e-commerce. And the second thing is like you offer me a financial service product, which is kind of like a different part of the brain maybe for the customers. That kind of a transition so far has not worked for most of the platforms. So this is where the omni-channel comes in, I think, in kind of a different way to approach the customers, to have that element of trust that is very important as part of the insurance, because I think that financial services product is generally so kind of more complicated and requires a little bit more nudging, interaction with some sort of a person that is advising the customer. It doesn't need to be kind of the traditional throughout, like pushing, here is a product, you must get it. But I think it's still, so far we have seen that it's still very important to have the personal interaction through that journey.
Yeah, really interesting. I'm sure it has a lot of significance for a lot of customers of ours, certainly, who have much of their business is heavily intermediated, and so actually points to the role of the intermediary to still provide that advice and guidance as to what represents best value for customers based on their needs, albeit technology is being used to support the relationship or enable them to have a deeper, closer relationship with them and open up those opportunities, I guess.
Absolutely right. So some of the examples that we've seen around the region is, like in Indonesia, we have quite a number of startups. I think there was about 4 or 5 startups that are doing something that's quite similar in the omni-channel way. And some of them started with the embedded space and tried to grow into bigger ticket size, but then omni-channel kind of came about as that model where all of them embraced it, and they actually started to acquire agencies and brokers to grow their business and to reshape them in a digital way. So there's Koala that is backed by Sequoia. There's Fuse, there's Pasapolis and LifePal, all kind of 4 focus on a fairly similar parallel models. I guess the bet is that once you're able to accumulate significant part of the market, then the efficiencies start to come in, and then you kind of start to be able to reshape it even further. But right now there is this kind of like a very interesting battle between all this startups to really consolidate the market up. And that's they're starting to expand across the region. Some of them have entered Thailand, for example, Singapore, and then Malaysia also expanding across this parallels. So that's the example from Indonesia. of course, on the bigger markets, it feels like a lot of the startups are going into the full stack model, which makes a lot more sense because of the product control. And that's kind of where you see the Indian startups going into that direction. The Chinese startups are also kind of heading in the similar directions as well.
Brilliant. Well, maybe there's a nice point to segue into kind of next question. If we got some broad themes, and then you're describing some of the regional variances. What are the kind of principal growth drivers for the region? And maybe we need to break that down into different parts, given the variances between them.
Yeah, I think that the growth ultimately is still underpinned by the same thing. It is the adoption of digital by the customers. So as the customers become a lot more comfortable with transacting through digital, I think that's really driving that growth together with it. So if you look at the embedded space right now, based on the success that the Grabs of the world and the Chinese and the Indian early adopters have played, all the platforms are basically looking at the insurance among the top 3 priorities for them. So that's driving a lot of growth in the embedded space, because everybody kind of like all the platforms woke up to the embedded insurance being a very good revenue driver, stickiness driver, and just the enhancement of the experience for their customer. So this is what's driving a lot of growth in the region, is that all those digital platforms are racing to embedded insurance and find that insurance that really works for their platforms. So it's still experimentation. Feels like there's it's still a version 1.5 of the embedded space, and we can talk a little bit about that. What's the version 2 look like? But that's kind of the key driver in that space. This space on the omni-channel way, I think there's like a kind of a pent-up pressure from the existing channels that they're all hitting the growth ceiling. So what the main driver is that through the COVID period, through this instability that happened, basically the growth that was there over the last 20 years or so in the region have really plateaued. So the customers are no longer buying. You can recruit another 500 agents, but then your sales are basically fairly stagnant. So that's driving a lot of change in that area. And I think customers' demands are also, and expectations are also changing. So as they start to transact more of their daily lives in digital, they're very frustrated every time that they have to touch the traditional mechanism and like go and fill up another form for the insurer. So that's I think the 2 catalysts in that more traditional insurance segment. And that's very interesting. Like in terms of the divide, if you look at it, the embedded space is still very much the peripheral space, even though it's growing very rapidly. Maybe it's doubling, tripling, I think, year on year. But it's still, if we look at Asia overall, I think it's like 0.5% at this point. Still 99.5% is still a traditional space. And this is where like omni-channel is becoming something that I think is going to that main shop and is starting to reshape the way that it's being done.
Great. And are there that's really interesting context, right? Because there's obviously, and quite rightly, there's a lot of interest in embedded. It's garnering a lot of headlines space for quite a significant period, and some really interesting projections as to the overall market growth. But could you, if it represents only a relatively small part of the overall market at the moment, that's pretty interesting. Could you give some examples of maybe some companies who are experimenting with the omni-channel, or either experimenting or seeing success with an omni-channel model?
So DG in India, I know that they're very big through this omni-channel way because they work with all the dealerships and utilize the agent networks. And I think that's what's basically what I'm hearing is that that's what's driving a lot of growth for them. We have Indonesia with their framework of kind of what we talked about a little bit earlier with the agents using referral networks to really lift it up in terms of distribution. Similarly in Thailand, in China, that omni-channel way is taking a very different form, and I think that's where I wanted to kind of talk about that version 2.0, what's starting to come about, where there is a lot more push towards the social media and agents going into the social media to really initiate those journeys, build up their trust, and then start from there to kind of blend this whole process together with a digital, non-digital, face-to-face through digital ways.
So it sounds like there's almost like a product distribution play. So startups who are able to, to provide that digital native experience, but also then leveraging the existing networks and existing capabilities within the business, but integrating them more effectively. Is that a fair assessment, or am I
absolutely
off?
Right. So I think what has happened up to this point is still a limited product innovation. So you kind of trying to fit the same products through the new channels, and that's obviously has a lot of friction, right? Because the products have been built maybe 20, 30 years ago, and it's all a bit clunky and very complicated and hard to understand. But as we see going forward, like say Zhongang in China, it is moving towards a very interesting product innovation place. The products that are actually much easier, much more frictionless to distribute through digital, but still require that element of interaction with a person to get people kind of understanding how does that fit. And one of the very interesting products that I wanted to highlight, and I think this is going to be the future where things are heading. It's called $1 million health insurance in China. And basically, it's if you're familiar with the health, it's a high deductible, high coverage, sum assured plans that are big because you're shifting the coverages up. Actually, it becomes very affordable. So for, let's say, $1 million coverage, you might be paying a couple of dollars a month. So that way, you're still moving in from the embedded space into more of a health space, and the premiums are, maybe it's $20 a year, kind of a range, let's say. But you still having a lot of interaction. You're doing a lot of education as part of that, using social media. In fact, Zhongang in China is one of the biggest spenders on TikTok by basically creating this, I would call it like a celebrity advisors, where people trust and believe in, and then from there they start to experience the health insurance. They interact with it, even kind of using new methods of distribution, like with this product being so relatively more affordable. People might get first couple of months free of this insurance. They experience it, they sign up, and then on the back of it, then you start to bring in things around the telesales, so that if the customer, you identify the segments that are has a high propensity of dropping off, and then you bring in the telesales to basically continue optimizing that whole conversion cycle. So this is where I think the things are going to get very, very interesting. And this is kind of the version 2.0, where you're changing the products, you're changing distribution in very fundamental ways. And then you're also changing the whole process of retention and using the data on the back of it to really continuously optimize it.
And how, so there's something really, my brain's immediately going into, immense detail into how that happens. I would extract myself out of the detail and simplify it. But how does someone like Zhongan, I can well imagine, the infrastructure is architected from the ground up to enable that much more frictionless delivery of new products, new services, and of course they're pouring money into R&D. How are incumbents responding? You have those age-old challenges of legacy infrastructure. Perhaps another way of looking at it might be, how is the insurtech market responding? Are we seeing lots of AI-driven underwriting solutions? Are we seeing, frictionless end-to-end policy management platforms? Is it the back end and of the value chain and claims? How is this all being? How would this future be enabled?
Yeah, so a lot of good questions to unpack. So
sorry, yeah, I said I preceded that with, let me try and simplify it and continue to make it really, really complicated. Apologies, George.
No problem. So in terms of the incumbents, I think what we're seeing is that, especially in China, a lot of the incumbents are moving to quickly embrace the products, especially like, once the product is validated, everybody kind of comes in and tries to basically scale on the back of it. So there is definitely an advantage, kind of a first mover advantage, but then the market follows very quickly. So the delay is not that large. And especially when it comes to the product innovation, it is something that needs to continuously happen. So far, Zhongang, I think, has been very successful at creating that engine of first redefining the embedded space, then redefining things around motor insurance, now health. So it is kind of basically going and redesigning and kind of reconfiguring products in a way that it's very, very innovative. But then the market is following very quickly. And now I think a lot of the eyes are on what next product is going to look like, what is the life insurance is going to look like from that perspective. So I think in that respect, there's been a lot of investment in digital. So if you look at like the Chinese market, like Ping An and Zhongang are this kind of like two huge drivers. One with I think 1 million agents on the ground, another one pure digital play, and now we have the resources from those going into AIA and Prudential to try to kind of also move more and more of the insurers in that direction as well. So digital is definitely taking off in a very, very big way to really kind of reshape the market. A lot of it, again, in China is driven by the adoption of digital in general is super high when it comes to the population. So if you look at all kinds of services, they're just all converging into like this digital universe from all different directions. So insurance is in a lot of ways following the rest of the ecosystem. And it feels like that's the trend that's also playing itself out in the other markets where like Southeast Asia, we looked at it and we said like, wow, 5 years ago, China was already very digital payments driven and Southeast Asia was still very cash driven. But right now it's very, very quickly catching on to that. So everybody is doing QR payments. Everybody is doing all this kind of a retraining basically through this period to really adopt this digital. And insurance is following very closely as a kind of subsequent trend to that. In terms of the technology, if we talk about like this kind of like a super advanced things about AI and others, it feels like actually a lot of it is still right now in the realm of data science, more so than the kind of a AI that we imagine. I think there are early experiments when it comes to automation of kind of a decisioning, but it's still not something that I would say at this point is really kind of shifting the trajectory in the market. So it's still very much using the technology as an enabler, but a lot of it is, I would say, hasn't really touched that deep when it comes to the technology. Still, we just evolving the technology, making sure the technology is there to support these different models, but it is still kind of, I would say, not super advanced technology in that sense.
Okay, really interesting. So actually, my questions were very focused on the world of the insurer, but actually you're talking about broader sort of macro level trends which are enabling or they're drivers of interest and adoption of and demand for these new digital services provided by the insurers.
It definitely feels that it's not the insurance will not move generally until there's either the market readiness or there's some sort of a tremendous pressure on the industry to move. So we are starting to, like in Southeast Asia, again, we're starting to see some of the regulators are coming in and saying, okay, let's have digital licenses. And it's causing insurers to really think very carefully of, okay, we didn't really have to do anything for past couple of years because embedded space is still, relatively small. The traditional space just starting to be redefined by Omni. So, the things are relatively stable from where they were, but it feels like that pace of change is accelerating and that pressure on the industry is increasing to do something different. And we already kind of have a bit of a preview of what does that look like by looking at the kind of a crystal ball of the Chinese and the Indian markets, where things are probably 2 to 3 years more ahead of us.
Yeah, really interesting. And how, as we think about that, one of the questions we get posed a lot is around, what's the significance of these trends in Asia for, I know I'm a domestic European carrier. What can we learn from what's happening in Asia? Have you got a perspective on that? How would you answer that question?
Yeah, I think that's a very good question. I think this is the question that I'm also been thinking about a lot, just in terms of this cross region. And in fact, I've been having a lot of conversations with people across the different regions, like even from Latin America and Europe and Asia. It feels like at this point, we have the insurtech that have reached a scale in their own domestic countries and is starting to go to regional basis. But we haven't really seen something at the scale where it goes like, let's say, like Uber or Airbnb, where they're become so massive, so saturated in their domestic market that they're starting to spill over across the regions. So significance to the European companies could potentially be to their Asian operations, if they have those. But I wouldn't say that yet it's kind of gonna impact the European market, the stuff that's happening in Asia. But you do see that there is kind of a cadence in terms of the innovation that's happening in one market is starting to make its way to other markets, and digital itself is progressing in a fairly uniform way. It's just that it takes probably different time frames depending on the needs of the market, and then that kind of the tide that is starting to lift itself across the different markets is taking slightly different time frames. So maybe the best way to think about it would be to think about it as a little bit of a preview of what could potentially happen. Embedded space probably was a couple of years ahead in Asia. Is starting to become a bigger topic in the other regions, like in Europe as well. I think there's a lot more interest in it, where it will follow that trend. And it's probably best to start to think about the kind of resources that you need to start to ramp up, the kind of investments that you need to make in a technology, not on the kind of let's redefine everything that we do today because it's going to be tomorrow, it's going to be very different. But I think in the next 10 years, it is going to make a fairly significant mark on the world of insurance. And it probably is something similar, like if I think about parallels, in our lifetime, we've seen like a bank insurance becoming something that was seen as, by the way thing to becoming a fairly significant chunk of the business for a lot of the insurers. And bank insurance, if you think about it, was still fairly traditional in the way that it was being done as very parallel to the normal insurance. But the digital is kind of coming in a slightly different way to really reshape how insurance is being done.
Brilliant. And kind of touched on it's that classic point in a discussion, and you kind of set yourself up because you mentioned 10 years out. What does the future hold, and have you got maybe, I don't know, one or two examples of really interesting or exciting startups that you're seeing in the region which exemplify those trends?
So the way I think about the future, and I think this is the way that things are going to head, is first of all, we're going to see a traditional space being more and more impacted by the digital. Another thing that's very interesting, I don't mean to continue going back to Zhongang, but I think it's they have a lot of experimentation, a lot of innovation coming in, which I think is kind of interesting to think about how that potentially spills over. So apart from the omni-channel and social media way of selling traditional products, now there's also very interesting in the embedded space, like the evolution of the embedded space that's moving from static products embedded with a single platform to being a very dynamic space. And the way that it's done is basically like the number of quotes that Zhongang generates per day from across the platforms. This is a number that really staggered me when I recently heard about it. It was something in the order of like a 10 billion quotes per day, which basically means that every platform makes API calls to the insurance, to Zhongang, to say, do you want to place an offer for this insurance in this part of the customer journey? Customer is about to take a ride. Customer is about to look at this particular product, and it's very dynamic, both in terms of the bidding and in terms of the products that you can offer through it. So obviously, at that kind of a scale, you cannot embed it in a very static way. Your machine has to quickly make a decision whether this is a customer that looks like a similar to the customer that we've seen before. What is the propensity to conversion? How does that value of bidding for this, let's say, couple of RMBs compared to the value that you can derive from that customer? So the embedded space seems to be gravitating towards that. And that's going to be, I would call it more of like a high frequency insurance rather than purely embedded insurance. And that's where I think it's very, very interesting. And obviously there's the evolution that's going to happen towards that, I think, as platforms become mature, and also to look at extracting more value from the insurance rather than, we're going to tie up between one insurer, one platform, and then it's going to sit there for the next 5 years. It is going to be very much about how do we maximize the value of the basically platform and the super apps. So that's one. I think the other thing that we're seeing very, very early emerging, but I think it's something that has a potential for tremendous change, is the kind of parallel finance story. So this is still very early conversations with the startups, where a lot of the crypto startups are starting to look at insurance being something that is being demanded by the customers. But at the same time, most of the insurers in the traditional space and reinsurers, whenever you start talking to them, they kind of go like, I don't want to hear it. This is something that's absolutely not a topic, which is I think is an interesting thing, because demand is clearly there. It is starting to really kind of reshape parts of the finance in terms of the wealth management, in terms of how people invest. People for example, in Indonesia, there's more crypto wallets than there's traditional bank accounts. So clearly there's a tremendous shift towards that, and there are a couple of people who are experimenting on that on the insurance and insurtech front, and I think that has a lot of potential to really kind of reshape it, because it really operates in a parallel. So in terms of the product innovation, in terms of kind of how things are, I think there is a very promising direction there. But again, it's not something that we've seen really taken off yet. But I do believe that we will see a lot more innovation happening in the space.
Brilliant. Well, that's also triggered another million questions in my mind, George. I'm conscious that we're nearly out of time. So let's maybe wrap there. Listen, thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it, and your insight into region, which is really fascinating. Thank you, George. It's been a pleasure, and we look forward to hopefully continuing the conversation on some of these topics in future as well.
Perfect. Thank you, man.